welcome to the 18th lecture in the Humanities Research Centre's Works That Shape the World public lecture series for 2022. This year, our focus has been on religion. So let me begin by acknowledging the elders of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people, whose traditional lands the Australian National University is built upon here in Canberra, and welcome our guest speaker, Malad Malani from Western Sydney University. Malad is a senior lecturer in religious studies, and he specializes in the study of Islam, particularly Persian Sufism. He's the author of several books, and you may detect a certain pattern here. These include Sufism in the Secret History of Persia, published in 2013, Sufi Political Thought, published in 2018, and most recently, The Nature of Sufism, an ontological reading of the mystical in Islam, published late last year by Routledge. Now, rumor has it that Malad may also soon be elected the next president of the Australian Association for the Study of Religion. So he'd be taking over from Anna Halifoff at Deakin University. And you might remember Anna from such public lectures as the Works That Shape the World session on the Tibetan Buddhist Logchen Rabjan a couple of months ago. So you can't bet on that the way you can bet on the Booker, but if you could, the smart money would be on Malad, the next president of the Australian Association for the Study of Religion. So we're very fortunate to have Malad Malani with us today to introduce us to a 12th century Persian Sufi work that has shaped the world, the Conference of the Birds.
Thank you, Ibrahim, for having me on this series, and it's a pleasure to be here amongst friends and colleagues. Thank you all for joining us. Allow me to also acknowledge country. I live and work on Darug land, and I offer my respects to its custodians and elders, past, present, and emerging. Let me get into this presentation. I've prepared a script. I'll read it without further introductory remarks, and hopefully we can have some discussions afterwards. The title of Aṭṭar's epic poem, Manṭiq al-Ṭayr, or in English translated Conference of the Birds, has most frequently been translated into English as the Conference of the Birds. Alternatively, some translators have preferred Parliament instead of conference, speech, and more recently, canticle, all of which relate to the Arabic term Manṭiq, that is usually understood to mean logic, logical speech, or eloquence. Because the story is about the community of birds that gather in preparation for a journey in search of their king, it is common sense to consider the title in terms of a conference or even Parliament of Birds. That they each speak in defense of their independent view in that gathering also justifies the reference to speech in the title. Rendering Manṭiq as canticle is, however, an intriguing move. A canticle is a hymn or a chant that is performed typically with a biblical text that then forms a regular part of a church service. Its usage calls to mind the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, also known as the Song of Solomon, and of course, the Canticle of Canticles. Canticle is also the other name for the Song of Songs used especially in the Vulgate Bible. In its association with Aṭṭar's poem, it therefore has the significance of denoting that it is a literary work, both homiletic and poetic in nature. So we could agree that in using the term canticle, the translator is aiming to capture the functional aspect of the poem. Indeed, the most popular version of available translations was published in 1984 by Penguin Classics under the title The Conference of the Birds. Translated fully into English for the first time by Afgham Darbandi and Dick Davis, they subsequently re-edited and re-released the translation in 2013 as an illustrated large copy published by Diane de Sellier with a new title bearing the term just discussed, The Canticle of the Birds. This interpretive translation of Manṭiq has the benefit of suggesting to the reader certain aspects of the poem's content that may not be readily represented by such terms as conference, parliament, or speech. In that vein, we might also be tempted to read the title by using another similarly provocative term, flight. I'll return to this point in a moment, but let me say for now that should we consider the title as reading The Flight of the Birds, then we might be able to detect something unusual about the poem that does not easily come into our grasp. And I say this because Aṭṭar, in writing the poem, is indeed pushing the limits of his readers' imagination and inviting them, in fact, to go along on this peculiar journey, which, given the proclivity of 12th century Sunni orthodoxy for religious and spiritual sobriety and level-headedness, does seem somewhat extravagant and even far-fetched. To that end, we become aware that Aṭṭar showed his preference for certain Sufi beliefs more than others, and it is these that define the epic. There are indeed two major themes that are dispersed throughout almost all the poem. These are the necessity for destroying the self and the importance of passionate love. So I repeat again, these are the necessity for destroying the self and the importance for passionate love. Davis offers an accessible description of these themes as follows in the 1984 introductory preface, which I should have brought up here. Sorry about that. He says, both are mentioned in every conceivable context and not only at the appropriate moments within the scheme. The two are connected. The self is seen as an entity dependent on pride and reputation. There can be no progress until the pilgrim is indifferent to both, and the commonest way of making him indifferent is the experience of overwhelming love. And if I may add, this overwhelming love is linked to another important idea in the poem, which is slightly more subtle in its usage by Aṭṭar, but it comes to have a tremendous consequence on the birds, as we will see later. This is the idea of shame, but shame that comes from knowing through love one's mistakes. As Davis points out, the love Aṭṭar chooses to celebrate, and let us note, the stories that deal with love are easily the most detailed and the longest of the poem, and is of a particular kind. It is always love that flies in the face of either social or sexual or religious convention. For example, it could be a love between a princess and a slave where social rank is broken. It could be homosexual love, or as in the case of the longest story of the poem, the story of Sheikh Sam'an, it could be love between people of different religions. Indeed, this story demonstrates just how far Aṭṭar is willing to push the boundaries of orthodoxy before relenting and allowing the reader to come back to a familiar sense of piety. To quote Davis again, in each case, the love celebrated is seen by the world as scandalous. And thus, as he goes on to say, the mention of scandal reminds us of the scandalous, blasphemous aspects of the Khorasanian tradition of Sufism to which Aṭṭar belonged, underlining the fact that the scandalous loves which Aṭṭar celebrates, their flouting of convention, are the allegorical counterpart of the spiritual scandalous abandonment. To give you an example of this, we read in the following line from the poem that sets up the story of the Sheikh. Whoever steps firmly in love passes beyond infidelity and religion. Therefore, we can easily say that Sufism was the anomaly in the Islamic world, though not alien to it, and that its most extravagant beliefs were inserted into poems and preserved by the medium of poetry. It is through its poetic expression, then, that Sufism was able to introduce, or rather, one could say, reintroduce, the extraordinary into Islam. The poetry has preserved the meaning, and that meaning has gone on to shape the thinking of world-renowned Sufis, such as, for example, Ibn al-Arabi and Rumi, who have come to overshadow, indeed, the recognition of Aṭṭar in popular imagination, and whose legacy now informs countless believers in the Sufi philosophies of passionate love and unity of being. Like many mystical poets, Aṭṭar deploys the use of paradox as a buffer against any attempt at a literal interpretation of what he says about the Sufi way, because what he says in the poem so often takes ordinary apprehension and expectations about religion and turns them inside out, thus turning conventional wisdom on its head. Obviously, important for our understanding of the key points of the poem is to appreciate the flexibility of language that Arabic and Persian offer. So we start with language, but language is only the place to start. Persian is known not only for its flexibility of meaning, but also and especially for the complexity of imagery that it conjures. Unlike the metaphor in English, which is a tool for portraying a visual image, Persian metaphors, as Davis reminds us, juxtapose words which have potent associations in a way that deepens and widens the meanings implied by the passage. He goes on to say that if the reader attempts to visualize the juxtaposition, the result is often ludicrous. He gives the beautiful example of Henry Vaughan's poem, "My Soul, There Is a Country," that has a line, "Sweet peace sits crowned with smiles," which Davis rightly identifies as being untypical of English metaphor, because it is absurd to try and see a personified peace with a crown literally made of smiles. What could such a crown look like? He asks. I share in his sense of humor when Davis observes that such a bizarre occurrence in literature might surprise English readers, but it would not startle a Persian poet. Following on with his example, so as to finish the thought and drive the point home, Davis says that the metaphor works, if it works, by juxtaposing the associations of peace, crowned, and smiles to convey, in this instance, a notion of benign authority, which is exactly how most Persian metaphors convey meaning. So if we think about the word flight, to which I referred earlier, in a similar way, then we could allow several meanings to come into play that outline the all-important relationship between what seems inconsequential and what comes to appear as meaningful. Let us note the word flight in use in everyday language. It denotes, among other things, a flight of stairs, the value of which is in the fact that one has to climb a flight of stairs to arrive at a desired destination, because a flight of stairs forms the connection between levels that exist. It can also mean the action of fleeing, in the sense that we are put to flight, wanting desperately to escape what we fear. Moreover, it can signify, especially in a literary sense, the swift passage of time. Finally, we might even think of it in terms of relating to the flight of the arrow toward its target. Of course, all of these become ever meaningful in the most obvious reference to the act of flying through the air, which directly relates to a journey made by a bird, birds that are in flight. Now, I would like to invite you to consider a further thought regarding language and meaning in the Persian setting. It concerns the elusive question of our relationship to the text. I raise it here in light of Aṭṭar's Epic of the Birds, because the birds, at the end of their journey, read the pages of their own self. as we will come to see, to discover the truth about their deeds, whereupon their selfhood is dissolved out of shame in realizing the extent of their betrayal. These are powerful words that form the closing chapter of Aṭṭar's epic, and they are certainly worthy of further reflection. In connection, we might get a better sense for the point on which Aṭṭar wants to end the poem if we briefly explain the importance of Davis's mentioning Aṭṭar's association with the Khorasanian tradition of Sufism. Aṭṭar was a native of Nishapur, which is a major city in the province of Khorasan, or the Khorasanian province, in present-day Iran. But during Aṭṭar's lifetime, it was known as Greater Khorasan and encompassed a larger terrain, including parts of South and Central Asia. Aṭṭar is therefore commonly known as Aṭṭar of Nishapur in Persian, in addition to his pen name Farid al-Din Aṭṭar or Fariduddin Aṭṭar. We know that Aṭṭar was partial to the Sufism of Khorasan because of the themes that he takes up in the poem. These are not his own, but belong to the sayings of Bayazid Bistami, who died in 874, and Mansur al-Hallaj, who was executed in 922. Two early Sufi mystical figures who feature prominently in the literary productions of major Persian Sufi poets who followed their style of a Sufism of intoxication. That Aṭṭar relies on the legendary tales of these two enigmatic early Sufis tells us that he is part of a long tradition of reviving not only Persian language and culture, Aṭṭar wrote in Persian, but that he was determined to emphasize the value as well as flesh out the quality of the ecstatic and antinomian mysticism which was championed by Bayazid and Hallaj. The ideas of Bayazid and Hallaj were preserved in Persian initially in the poems of the charismatic sheikh of Khorasan, Abu Sa'id al-Ṭayr, who died in 1049. This Khorasanian style of Sufism is essentially defined by the ideas of Bayazid and Hallaj, which, as Davis describes, become the staple of Persian mystical literature when they were taken up by Sana'i prior to Aṭṭar. Sana'i was an influential 12th century court poet of the Ghaznavids, the ruling Islamic Persian dynasty of Greater Khorasan at that time. And depending on agreements about the dates for Aṭṭar's birth and death, Aṭṭar was likely a young man when Sana'i had written his magnum opus. Sana'i was the first of three to introduce Sufi teachings into long narrative Persian poems, written also in couplets, by way of his work, The Garden of the Truth. The others are Aṭṭar with Manṭiq al-Ṭayr, who wrote in the same style, and Rumi with Masnavi and Ma'navi. But Aṭṭar's poem is both a shorter work and it improves on Sana'i's by introducing an extended allegorical form, which is itself continually interesting and amusing. And I'm quoting Davis, to quote Davis, and quite rightly, as Davis points out, which has moments of great psychological insight, humor, and narrative suspense. I further agree with Davis that Aṭṭar had successfully transformed belief into poetry, much in the way that Milton and Dante did. Now let us return to the question earlier posed about the relationship to the text. To answer this question in the context of the Epic of the Birds, I should first outline the allegorical framework of the poem. Now I will pause on the bird hoopoe. The birds are gathered and told by their leader, a bird known as the hoopoe, that they have a king who is called the Simorgh. But he lives far away, and to get to him they must venture on a long and perilous journey. The birds are initially excited to start their quest, but as the difficulty of the journey becomes apparent, they begin to make excuses. The duck, for example, prefers her stream to the domain of the Simorgh, as water is all that she has known. The peacock wants to find his way back to his beloved paradise and has no interest in seeking a mysterious king in a place unknown. The owl protests that real treasure is found in ruins of old, and the search for the Simorgh is a childish game. And so on, the birds continue to speak. The hoopoe answers each of their excuses with parables that dispel their concerns. Eventually, they all fly a little, agreeing to be led by the hoopoe, but then pause to ask their leader questions about the way before advancing further. Again, the hoopoe skillfully replies with anecdotes that satisfy the birds. A final question is asked about how long the journey will take, since they are now weary and tired and cannot see the point of it anymore. And in reply to the birds, the hoopoe shares with them his knowledge of the 7 valleys of the way. These are briefly quest, love, insight into mystery, detachment, unity, bewilderment, and the final stage, which is typically Sufic, is poverty and nothingness. They agree to continue and at last arrive at the court of the Simorgh. At first they are turned back, but after a while they are permitted to enter. What they discover is that the goal of their quest was in the end themselves. Aṭṭar's clever play on words is the key to the story, in that the reader is told that only 30 birds remain, as many of them did in fact perish along the way, and others had abandoned the journey altogether. And thus in Persian, the Simorgh is, that is, 30 birds meet the Simorgh, the king they had sought. The birds now in mystical communion hear the words. With all the dangers that the journey brought, the journey was in me, the deeds were mine. So now, if I may be permitted, I would like to read the final section in the time that remains of the poem to help us see the connection between the 2 ideas of passionate love and shame, which bring to bear the mystical virtue of the spiritual necessity for destroying the self, as earlier noted. These are key experiential phenomena that are a part of the Khorasanian style of Sufism we have discussed, and they serve as a didactic device in the poem. In short, it is essentially about the birds' shame in having realized their neglect of destiny, and thus through it, their selfhood is erased, allowing them to arrive at the truth of their being, the Simorgh. So I will just read from the Conference of Birds, Dick Davis's translation. It's page 220, just a couple of pages, 217 to 220. So I'm just going to start in the middle of the story, but it will make sense as I go on. When Malik Dar bought Joseph as a slave, the price agreed and which he gladly gave seemed far too low to be quite sure he made. The brothers sign a note for what he'd paid. And when the wicked purchase was complete, he left with Joseph and the sealed receipt. At last, when Joseph ruled in Egypt's court, his brothers came to beg and little thought. To whom it was, each bowed his humbled head, and as a suppliant appealed for bread. Then Joseph held the scroll up in his hand and said, "No courtier here can understand. These Hebrew characters, if you can read, this note I'll give you and all the bread you need." The brothers could read Hebrew easily and cried, "Give us the note, your majesty." If any of my readers cannot find himself in this account, the fool is blind. When Joseph gave them that short document, they looked and trembled with astonishment. They did not read a line, but in dismay debated inwardly what they should say. Their past sins silenced them. They were too weak to offer an excuse or even speak. Then Joseph said, "Why don't you read? You seem distracted, haunted by some dreadful dream." And they replied, "Better to hold our breath than read and in so doing merit death." The 30 birds read through the fateful page and there discovered stage by detailed stage their lives, their actions set out one by one, all that their souls had ever been and done. And this was bad enough, but as they read, they understood that it was they who'd led the lovely Joseph into slavery, who had deprived him of his liberty deep in a well, then ignorantly sold their captive to a passing chief for gold. Can you not see that each breath you sell, the Joseph you imprisoned in that well, that he will be the king to whom you must, naked and hungry, bow down in the dust? The chastened spirits of these birds became like crumbled powder, and they shrank with shame. Then, as by shame their spirits were refined, of all the world's weight they began to find a new life flow towards them from that bright, celestial, and ever-living light. Their souls rose free of all they'd been before. The past and all its actions were no more. Their life became from that close, insistent sun, and in its vivid rays they shone as one. There in the Simorgh's radiant face they saw themselves, the Simorgh of the world, with awe. They gazed and dared at last to comprehend. They were the Simorgh and the journey's end. They see the Simorgh, at themselves they stare, and see a second Simorgh standing there. They look at both and see the two are one, that this is that this, the goal is one. They ask, but inwardly they make no sound, the meaning of these mysteries that confound. Their puzzled ignorance, how is it true that we is not distinguished here from you? And silently their shining Lord replies, I am a mirror set before your eyes, and all who come before my splendor see themselves their own unique reality. You came as 30 birds and therefore saw these self-same 30 birds, not less nor more. If you had come as 40, 50 here, an answering 40, 50 would appear. Though you have struggled, wandered, traveled far, it is yourselves you see and what you are. Who sees the Lord? It is himself each sees. What ant's sight could discern the Pleiades? What anvil could be lifted by an ant? Or could a fly subdue an elephant? How much you thought you knew and saw, but you now know that all you trusted was untrue. Though you traversed the valley's depths and fought with all the dangers that the journey brought, the journey was in me, the deeds were mine. You slept secure in being's inmost shrine. And since you came as 30 birds, you see, these 30 birds when you discover me, the Simorgh, truth's last flawless jewel, the light in which you will be lost to mortal sight, dispersed to nothingness until once more you find in me the selves you were before. Then, as they listened to the Simorgh's words, a trembling dissolution filled the birds. The substance of their being was undone, and they were lost like shade before the sun. Neither the pilgrims nor their guide remained. The Simorgh ceased to speak, and silence reigned.